Hi, welcome everybody to our second edition of Wing Spotlight Interviews. Joining me today is Roland Horne, who is the director of the Stanford Geothermal Program and also the professor of energy science and engineering at Stanford University. Welcome, Roland. I just want to get things kicked off right away. And let's jump into learning a little bit about your background. Can you tell us about your journey to becoming a prominent figure in the geothermal energy and reservoir engineering space?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth. Although I've been at Stanford University for a very long time, I'm originally from New Zealand, and then and now, geothermal energy is an important part of New Zealand life. In those days, in particular, in the 1970s, when I was a graduate student, geothermal energy in New Zealand was kind of like the Apollo program in the United States. It was the sort of technological leading edge. And so engineering students like me wanted to be part of that. So when I entered graduate study, I went to talk to the professor that I liked and said, can I do research on geothermal energy? And he said, yes. And so I've been doing that ever since. I did my PhD in the University of Auckland, and then I came to Stanford University to join the Stanford Geothermal Program in 1976. And at that time, that's when geothermal energy was kind of taking off in the United States, particularly in California. And they made the assumption, perhaps rashly, that anybody from New Zealand actually kind of understood geothermal energy well. And so that's how I managed to swing the job.
Well, that's interesting. I actually have been to New Zealand. I visited Contact Energy and got to see their geothermal field, which was quite impressive to visit. So when you came, were there a lot of universities to choose from that had geothermal programs?
At that time, very few. There were some. So, during the two oil shocks in the 1970s and the first kind of major shift of interest towards renewable energy, geothermal was kind of hot, if you'll excuse the pun, at that time. And quite a lot of universities had programs, or at least research, directed towards geothermal energy. So Stanford was not the only one. I wasn't at the time actually thinking much about choosing. I wrote to all of them and said, I'm finishing my PhD. Have you got a job? And Stanford was the one that replied.
Okay, well, fate in the work. Okay, so let's do a comparison. Back in the 1970s with geothermal, so there's a lot of buzz, and now there's a lot of buzz with geothermal. What are the differences between the 70s and now with geothermal?
In actual fact, it's probably more interesting to talk about the similarities because,
Okay.
they're driven by slightly different forces, or social and economic and political forces, but they're very much aligned. People were looking at that time for alternatives, and specifically alternatives to fossil fuels, oil and gas. And in the 1970s, that's because people believed that oil and gas was running out, and in particular, the US was, changed in the early 70s from a net oil exporter to a net oil importer. And so the target was to look for other sources of energy other than fossil fuels. So totally different reason, but the actual path was very similar.
Okay, so let's walk through what your experience, because you've been at Stanford for 48 years as a professor.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so can we walk through? I mean, you must have just a lot that you've seen in the geothermal space, and I'd like to pick your brain and maybe walk through what that experience has been like and how you've witnessed geothermal evolving over time.
So there is again a kind of a similarity, at least from the US standpoint, in geothermal between the 70s and now, in that, when we held the first Stanford Geothermal Workshop in 1975, actually I wasn't there, I went to the second one.
Okay.
But the people who came to the Stanford Geothermal Workshop at that time were talking about ideas, what they were planning to do in geothermal. there were some operating geothermal plants already in the US at that time, but in a small way. So in terms of expanding and doing new things, it was a very similar vibe. Everybody was laying their ideas on the table. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. But that was the kind of the sense of the geothermal industry in the 1970s. It was kind of launching. And right now it's doing much the same thing. It's kind of relaunching. We've had a continuous geothermal industry in the US since the 70s, but we're looking now for geothermal 2.0, with similar kinds of discussions taking place, new ideas, new players. So there's a very similar kind of a vibe.
Yes, well, hopefully now we're in an era where it will move forward and launch. So can you highlight some of the noteworthy students that you have mentored or taught that are now working in the geothermal space?
People?
Yeah.
Well, many. So
Okay.
actually the Stanford Geothermal Program has populated geothermal, power projects around the world actually for 50 years or more, since
Yeah.
before I went to Stanford. So in particular, in the early days of the geothermal success, geothermal has been a steady and solid piece of the energy portfolio, particularly in California and Nevada, for all of that time, 50 years. 6% of electricity in California and 10% of electricity in Nevada currently coming from geothermal. But anyway, in those early days, one of the biggest players in geothermal development, not only in California, but also in the Philippines and Indonesia, was Unocal. And Unocal actually had many Stanford Geothermal Program graduates, particularly in the reservoir engineering side, which is our particular specialty of geothermal. So, prominent geothermal reservoir engineers in Unocal included people like Mahinder Gulati, who I think retired as the chief reservoir engineer, Carl Strobel, Ben Barker, Paul Atkinson. Really, there were many of them. So they played a very significant part in the establishment of the US kind of geothermal industry, given that Unocal was the largest, not only in California, they were the largest in the Philippines too, and they were a significant player in Indonesia, and were for many years until they were purchased by Chevron. So
Oh,
that's one example, but
okay.
in more recent examples, we also have some prominent graduates. Perhaps the biggest rock star is Jack Norbeck, who is a CTO and one of the co-founders of Fervo Energy. So he's obviously made a very strong impact and will make greater ones to come. Rita Okorafor, who is now a professor at Texas A&M, is one of our recent graduates, prominent person in the geothermal industry. And perhaps another is Mark McClure, who started the company ResFrac, working in sort of helping people understand how fractures are made and how to make them better. And choosing those few names actually perhaps does disservice to more than 100, probably close to 200 other graduates who are also prominent. Actually, another one I should mention is John Murphy, who is a reservoir engineer for Ormat. So he's sort of central in their activities. So I mean, these are the companies that make a big difference. They're the big players in the geothermal community, and we have people in almost all of them, and not only American companies, a lot of overseas companies as well.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you see a lot of students now wanting to study geothermal? What has the trend been like? If we go back to your early days in the 70s, did it peak then, drop off, and is there more interest now?
There probably was a greater interest in the 70s and early 80s, but the interest has been kind of steady.
Okay.
It's picked up again recently as well, but there wasn't sort of a hole in between. because, although we've seen a lot of expansion in the last 5-10 years or so, we've had steady development in geothermal throughout the last 50 years. So there's always been people interested in studying it. People went out and got jobs in it throughout that time. There have been some slow periods in the US, when the oil and gas prices were cheap. There was sort of a fading of interest in geothermal, but that wasn't worldwide. So we're an international student body here. So we have students from all kinds of different countries. So we've had people from Costa Rica and Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, who came to study geothermal with us and then went back and participated importantly in their own countries' geothermal communities.
Yeah, that's great that you guys are serving the international scope with geothermal. Okay, so can we look at and talk about some of your significant academic achievements over the last couple of decades? And I'm just very curious to learn about some of the research that you've done, and what type of geothermal you're most excited about. It's a lot of that I packed into that question.
Yes, there's a lot in there. So the things that I like to think we've made the greatest differences with, there's obviously been very many of them, but during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, conventional geothermal fields have depended a lot on multi-phase flow, steam and water. And how steam and water moves through fractured rocks, which is typically what conventional geothermal fields are using in volcanic areas, was largely unknown. Everybody understood that, for example, relative permeability was needed. We needed to know what that was to simulate geothermal reservoirs, but it hadn't been measured and is very difficult to measure. So one of our important contributions was actually understanding steam water relative permeability. And then secondly, the flow itself. Tracer analysis is something which was an important contribution from Stanford. In the last 10 years or so, two-phase flow has become less important because of the focus towards EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, which people often assume, probably correctly, but not necessarily, are going to be single-phase flow, flowing liquid water, because that's the most advantageous heat transfer. And therefore, the focus has moved towards EGS. And one of the biggest unknowns, the biggest technological challenges is fracturing. So we have focused quite a lot on analyzing how to create the kind of fractures that you want, to determine what kind of fractures do you want, which ones are most advantageous, from the point of view of energy recovery, and how do you actually interpret, how do you actually analyze what's in the ground to see what you've created after you've created it, whatever it was that you wanted, what did you actually get as a result of the fracture treatment?
Do you have a choice of what type of fracture you're going to get? Isn't that dependent upon the reservoir?
You would like to think that you have. So, there is, in fact, engineering design in fracturing. And so there is strategies by which you could at least attempt to get an advantageous fracture distribution.
Okay. Well, we don't have to go into the specifics. My background is in fracking, so for me, I love that topic, but I don't know if all of our listeners are in the fracking space. But so we talked about some of the research. What would you say has been the most noteworthy? Is it the relative permeability for conventional, would you say?
That's a hard question, because I've had probably more than 100 students in total, but things that I think have given what I'm proud of isn't necessarily what has given the greatest impact to the community.
Okay. Okay.
I'm going to refer to the impact.
Okay.
I think Mark McClure's work, actually, which Jack Norbeck also did his PhD in this area as well, was looking at understanding fracturing, the same issue we just talked about.
Okay.
And importantly, Mark McClure won a quite significant award from SEG, the economic, what's SEG stand for? Society of
Oh,
Geophysics. Anyway, he won a significant award for looking at how earthquakes are generated during the process of stimulation for
yeah.
EGS, and how they could be, so which was interesting and important, but more significantly, how to ameliorate those earthquakes so that they don't cause people damage. So he and subsequently Jack Norbeck made very important contributions in that regard.
I didn't realize that. I know Mark. I've followed his work, but I didn't realize that he
And
had
then
done.
also, in addition, I mean, separately from that and in a different direction altogether, more recently, undergraduate Mohammed Al-Jibran, who looked at the economics of EGS in a very detailed study that looked at, time of day, whether the sun's shining or not shining, temperature, the grid distribution, all of those things. So not just geothermal, but how geothermal fits in a renewable portfolio, how it compares to solar, etc. So that was it's a study that's we get a lot of requests for information about, that people are looking at how to integrate geothermal into their portfolios. So, when I say people, I mean utilities and states and these kind of institutions. So that's a study which was not only quite illuminating, but I think, stands to make an impact in actually, expanding the geothermal development in the future.
Yeah. So I had a question that I had captured here, and maybe you've already answered it, but it was, what is the most pressing issue that you're currently focusing on in geothermal research? Would it be like the economics with EGS?
So, I mean, we're engineers, so we do look at economics, but it's not our principal thing.
Okay.
Muhammad Al-Jibran again, so the question that he set out to answer, and ultimately came to as well, partially, was how do we make geothermal flexible? So geothermal power plants just like to run 24/7, 100% load all the time. That's the way they're most effective, and it's difficult to ramp them up and ramp them down the way that you do with a natural gas plant. However, if we're going to integrate large amounts of geothermal into the grid, ultimately we have to have, excuse me, we have to have dispatchability. We need to be able to ramp up and ramp down. And how to actually run a geothermal field in such a way is an open question. It's not unsolved. There have been suggestions made, and operating geothermal plants in many cases have been modified in an attempt to raise them up and down a little bit. They don't like to go a lot. So how to fit geothermal, which likes to be base load, into a very intermittent portfolio is, I think, one of the biggest questions that's on the table for our industry right now.
Okay, so if I understand, so with conventional, we know how to operate the field, but with EGS, that hasn't been done before. We've actually have multiple wells and we have to operate the entire field. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Correct. So the field as a whole, from that point of view, EGS isn't all that much different. So,
Okay.
The reason it's hard to dispatch or to be flexible with a geothermal power plant in general, whether conventional or EGS, is because you can't switch the wells on and off, because they go through thermal cycles, get casing damage, you get expansion,
I
and
see.
things like
Okay.
that. So, for example, the power plant in Puna in Hawaii has to be dispatched because it's in an island grid. If there's no load on the plant, then they have to stop sending electrons onto the grid. And they have several ways of actually adjusting the output of that plant. One of which is to basically just bypass the power plant altogether. So they keep producing the wells and they just put the water back in the ground again, which seems wasteful, but actually the energy isn't thrown away. It just goes back where it came from and gets produced tomorrow instead. There's a small cost for pumping, but so that's one example of a relatively kind of brute force way of achieving flexibility. But it would be nice to have something a bit more elegant and a bit more directly controllable.
Okay. So, and I've been to that Puna plant. That they've got quite a remarkable story with their whole volcano.
Volcanic eruption also, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be a movie. Um, okay, so then your students are actively working on looking at controlling or running a plant in this manner of being able to dispatch or turn it on and off.
Yes, so that was the direction of Mohammed Al-Gibran's PhD,
Okay, got it.
soon to be
Interesting.
finished.
Okay, very interesting. Um, all right, so my question, 2025, do you think we are going to see significant breakthrough for geothermal in 2025?
I hope so. I mean,
Okay,
I think we saw a significant breakthrough in 2024, which hopefully will continue. As you undoubtedly know, I think what people are most excited about is the experience of both Fervo and Forge in drilling. So, in both cases, they successfully improved their drilling rate, cut down their drilling time from well to well by massive amounts, 50% in some cases. And that opens the door for EGS in particular. It brings the economics down so that EGS looks to be competitive to the average levelized cost of electricity from any source. But we also have to recognize that it improves the economics of all geothermal sources. So cheaper, faster drilling is good for EGS, but it's good for all geothermal.
sure.
So we are going to see, I'm sure, significant improvements in deployment of geothermal of the conventional type as well as EGS. And it will be in the US, but it will also be worldwide. Anybody who can put a PDC bit on their drill rig, which is pretty much everybody, is likely to be doing that right now, I would think.
So, I mean, there's more than just EGS and your conventional. Do you have research projects that are outside of that, maybe in advanced geothermal systems or hot sedimentary aquifers, or even recovering
Not
heat from
directly,
gas
there's
wells?
there's a lot of research or a lot of talk about other kinds of systems, mostly unproven. So we've been focusing on the ones which look likely to be widely deployed. So EGS.
What drives the research topics? Is it projects coming from developers or DOE or grants or?
It's a variety. So the DOE is obviously very impactful in terms of, a lot of our funding comes from them. So they're interested in EGS. So we are too. However, Stanford Geothermal Program also has a kind of a significant voice, or we imagine that we do. So, we attempt to influence agencies like Department of Energy, to participate in their discussions about what is important. So, we think EGS is important, not just because that's where the money is. We're trying to influence the money to be in that because we see the importance of it. We would probably be interested in hot sedimentary aquifers, if we were in Texas or Australia, but given where we are and the
Yeah.
experience that we have, we haven't focused on that because we've been, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have developed a large background and expertise in fractured rocks, which is typically not what you're talking about in hot sedimentary aquifers.
Like revitalization of existing geothermal fields. Do you have research that looks at that?
So fracturing in general. So we have done quite a number of projects looking at fields that have been in production for 30, 40 years. So they're getting to the point where the developers are trying to squeeze the last bits of energy out of them. We've had a significant direction of research here, not only in geothermal, but in the other areas of energy development that I and my colleagues here in this energy science and engineering department have followed on machine learning. Everybody's talk about AI. We're not really doing that. But machine learning and data analytics has been important to us for now about 10 years, including in geothermal. So data analytics has been applied, and people are talking about applying it to geothermal in many different ways, including exploration. The direction that we have followed has been looking at understanding, operating fields. What are we seeing that, when well A is producing, well B, changes its chloride, so what does that mean? And how do we take advantage of that? How do we regulate individual well flows so that we get the maximum advantage from the field?
Where do you get all the data from?
The data?
Yeah.
Companies have actually, and the companies are interested in that question too. So we've actually enjoyed good relationship with companies who've provided data for that.
Okay. Yeah, that's important. Okay, I want to know a little bit more about yourself. I know I've asked a lot of questions about what your research topics and geothermal at Stanford. But with all of the individuals that I've interviewed, I always like to know a little bit about their hobbies, what a typical day looks like. And I'd love to learn.
I don't have any hobbies except
No
working.
hobbies. I'm
So
sure you.
I when I was younger, I used to climb mountains and go skiing, but I'm getting a bit old for that now.
Okay.
So my work is kind of my life. I work with a lot of very smart, engaged students, and that's very important to me, and I enjoy it a lot. So that's the principal focus of my activities. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and every year you do put together the geothermal workshop. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? Because it's coming up pretty quickly.
Yes, it is. Coming up in February 10th is the 50th Stanford Geothermal Workshop. So we've been running that continuously now for 49 years, soon to be 50. So the Stanford Geothermal Workshop has been kind of a foundation of actually not only the technical and sort of scientific communication and exchange that takes place in the US principally, but also worldwide. But it's also kind of served as a kind of a template or prototype for very similar meetings that have taken place in many other countries. And actually, one of the ways I know this is because in 1978, I spent a year and a half at the Geothermal Institute in the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I started on that occasion the New Zealand Geothermal Workshop as a kind of a replica of the Stanford Geothermal Workshop. And it's, I guess, now in its 47th or 48th year as well. But very similar kind of meetings have been, formulated in the Philippines and other places. So one of the characteristics of the Stanford Geothermal Workshop, thinking back to what I said earlier about the time in the 1970s, people came and talked about their ideas and their plans. It's not, you can think of it as a conference. It's a bit more formal than it used to be, but people still come and talk about ideas, things that they're thinking about doing. People talk about research that's half finished. They've discovered this so far, and it's an opportunity where people, other experts in the field, come and say, well, could you try this? Or we don't agree with that. It's an opportunity for people to engage about their research before it's finished, while it's still in progress. And that's why we call it a workshop and not a conference. And that kind of interchange, I think, is important in any field, but I think in particular has been important in geothermal.
Yeah. So how many papers did you receive this year?
So, we received 420 abstracts for
Wow.
this meeting. So typically we accept almost all of the abstracts, except, sometimes we get a few which actually aren't about geothermal at all, so we don't take them. But this year we simply understood that we could not possibly fit that many papers in to the meeting. So last year's meeting, for example, had 180 eventual presentations. That's the number we had room for in the actual timetable. So we had to reject some. We rejected about 100 actually. So we ended up with 320 abstracts. And typically we have a certain amount of shrinkage, people who don't eventually deliver the papers, but normally about 20-30%.
Wow.
But we're expecting well in excess of 200 papers eventually this year. So we're changing the schedule. Actually, we've made the schedule quite a bit longer.
Wow.
Fit them in.
Well, I went last year and I thought I was impressed. I didn't know what to expect because it was my first year, and I was just shocked at the number of people. How many people attend this event or attended last year?
I think we had 300 last year.
Do you think is it going up this year?
Yes, for sure. So interestingly enough, so we talk about data analytics.
Yeah.
Looking back over the last 10 years or so, the number of people who eventually come is almost always equal to the number of abstracts that were first submitted, understanding that abstracts doesn't eventually relate to the number, or is not equal to the number who eventually present. So
Yeah.
last year, 320 abstracts ended up to be 160 presentations. This year we have 420 abstracts, so we expect 420 people.
Okay.
And actually we have 250 registrants already.
Well, people always register last minute, so
And
I know
I have
there's a lot of people I've talked to that are coming.
100 authors who haven't registered yet. So if you're out there, get registered.
This will be a great reminder. Okay, so what does a typical day look like?
My day?
Yeah.
Well, I come into the office, I teach 2 or 3 days per week, depending on whether it's a Tuesday, Thursday class or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Engineering graduate classes, quite a lot of work everywhere. At Stanford, we need to come up with new homeworks every year. So if, I'm sort of formulating new homeworks, which have to lead the students through the material that we're teaching them. They have to be non-trivial, but not too hard. So that's quite a difficult challenge to meet oftentimes. So formulating homeworks is a significant part of the actual class. I also have to give the lecture, but that's not such a long time consumption. And then I have about 10, 12 graduate students, and I meet all of them twice a week, once individually and once as a group. So I spend, quite a lot of every day meeting with students. And then there's all the other bureaucratic nonsense that they make you do in a university, which I try to avoid as much as possible.
I get it. I get it. My brother is actually a professor. He's at University of California, San Diego, him and his wife. So I hear all the stories. Okay, let's talk about mentorship because at Women in Geothermal, we're big into mentorship. I'm curious, who who have been the key people who have influenced you or mentored you?
Yeah, so I think mentorship has always been important in people's lives. Notably, however, it was much less formalized, when I was young than it is nowadays. Now there's a structure and we've got mentor training, etc. But in the 1970s, people just kind of did it because it was a good thing to do. And I had um, my department chairman, Hank Ramey, who was a prominent geothermal reservoir engineer. In fact, he almost invented geothermal reservoir engineering by taking petroleum reservoir engineering and modifying it for geothermal use in the 1960s. He was a very generous, warm-hearted guy. I was a young professor working under him, and he influenced me a lot, first as a role model, but secondly, he would sort of give little nuggets of advice from time to time, in order to improve your chances of tenure and promotion, whatever. First author papers are a good idea, so make sure you write a few of those and these kind of suggestions. So he was very important. The Geothermal Rising has an award, the Reservoir Engineering Award, which is named after him.
That's super cool. All right. So, and I assume that you mentor and guide your graduate students. That's something that you probably do, correct?
Correct. So that's my job. I
Yeah.
tend not to do that so formally, but also it is part of my job, as well as my sort of personal interest and motivation to help them advance as much as they can and succeed in their life. So we're often talking about solving differential equations, but if it comes up about how to improve job chances or things like that, we talk about that too.
Differential equations is fun. I liked that class. Okay, so my last question is, what advice would you have for the younger generation that is looking to advance in geothermal?
So geothermal is an interesting field. In fact, a lot of resource development is interesting in terms of the breadth of things that you need to really get your head around. We're talking about the subsurface, so geoscience is important. We're talking about fluids flowing through the subsurface and transferring heat. So, fluid mechanics and thermodynamics are important too. So one of my principal piece of advice to students in particular, and that's the people I often see, but young people in general, is, make sure your foundation in those basics is solid. It's okay to spend time looking at how the geothermal industry works and how drilling permits are made, and I mean those are all important things to do as well. But if you don't know your physics, chemistry, and math and geology, then you're going to be at a disadvantage.
They're very important topics. All right, well, I want to thank you for joining me today and letting me ask you these fun, I think the questions are fun questions. I don't know if you have any last words or anything else that you want to share before we sign off.
I think geothermal has always been good, and it's going to be better in the years ahead. So it's a great time to be joining the geothermal community. And if you're already in, it's a good time to be in.
All right, well, thank you so much.